A real father doesn't raise his voice when he's pushed to the limit. He doesn't scream, he doesn't throw things, and he certainly doesn't beg. He goes dead silent. The world thinks anger is loud, a roaring engine, a shattering glass, a string of cursed words thrown in the heat of a moment. But true, bone-deep anger, the kind that alters the trajectory of lives, is as quiet as snowfall in the Rockies. And on the day my own son told me he wished I'd never existed, I didn't yell either. I didn't even stand up quickly. I just sat there in the silence of my own making, put my fork down with a slow, deliberate click against the imported porcelain, and gave him exactly what he asked for. It was Father's Day in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado. 72 degrees, crisp, thin mountain air, and a sky so violently blue it looked painted. My wife, Evangeline, had spent the entire morning arranging the patio of our lakeside estate. She had the fine Belgian linen out, the heavy silver that only saw the light of day for weddings or funerals, and the good crystal that rang like a church bell if you tapped it with a fingernail. She'd dressed the table as if we were hosting the governor of Colorado instead of eating smoked prime ribeye in our own backyard. I run Vance Industrial Systems, 3 high-end commercial HVAC, mechanical engineering, and automated climate control firms stretching from Denver up to Fort Collins. I built the entire empire from a single, rusted-out tool van that my own father couldn't afford to keep running when his joints gave out in the late 80s. 29 years of 5 a.m. starts in freezing warehouses. 29 years of breathing in sheet metal dust, burning my fingers on copper solder, and negotiating contracts with men who would have chewed me up and spat me out if I showed a single second of weakness. I did all of it so my son, Julian, could grow up with a panoramic view of the Front Range, a heated infinity pool that ran all winter, and a last name that carried weight in any bank in the state of Colorado. You'd think that buys you something. A little respect, maybe. A modicum of understanding. Turns out, it buys you a Father's Day dinner, where your 26-year-old kid looks you dead in the eye and tells you he wishes you were never born into his life. I'd spent that Sunday morning the way I spend every Sunday morning of my life. I was up at 5:30 a.m., long before the sun had cleared the eastern plains, long before Evangeline had even stirred in our bed. I poured myself a mug of black coffee, no sugar, no cream, just hot and bitter, and walked out onto the stone patio. I sat in one of the cedar chairs, watching the automated lawn sprinklers hiss and sweep across the manicured bluegrass in the exact same rhythmic, predictable pattern they always did. I like predictability. I like machines that do what they are engineered to do. People are chaotic. Machines are honest. If an HVAC compressor fails, it's because a valve blew or the voltage spiked. There's always a cause, a clear sequence of physical laws. But people, you can feed them, house them, protect them, and pour your life's blood into their veins, and they'll still turn around and bite the hand that kept the cold out. Evangeline came out around 8 a.m. in her silk robe, her hair tied back in that effortless way she's managed since we were in college. She leaned down, kissed the top of my head, and smelled of lavender and sleep. "Try not to lecture him today, Garrick," she said softly, her hand lingering on my shoulder. "It's his one day to relax." "When have I ever lectured that boy, Eva?" I asked, taking a slow sip of my coffee. She didn't answer with words, she just gave me the look. 29 years of marriage, and that woman has one specific, asymmetrical tilt of her eyebrows that does the work of 1,000 lawyers. It was the same look she gave me when I told Julian his vintage sports car was a money pit, or when I pointed out that his consulting firm had generated exactly 0 revenue in 18 months. "Yesterday's conversation about his overdue rent on the loft," I said, defending myself. "That wasn't a lecture. That was basic double-entry bookkeeping. That was math." "It's Father's Day," Evangeline sighed, her fingers squeezing my neck. "Let the math rest, just for today. Promise me?" I looked out over the flat water of the lake, watched a mallard duck break the reflection of Mount Evans, and promised her I would. I should known better. Making a promise about Julian before Julian himself had a say in the day was like planning a harvest before checking the weather forecast. Julian showed up late, of course. The reservation we had made for our family dinner at home was set for 2 p.m. At 2:45, The low, throaty hum of an electric performance engine finally vibrated through the limestone gate of the driveway. It was my Audi e-tron GT, a $90,000 piece of German engineering finished in tactical gray. I say my Audi because, despite Julian telling everyone in Denver it was his, the title was currently locked in the fireproof safe in my office, registered under Vance Industrial Systems as a corporate fleet vehicle. I'd let him drive it for the past year under the assumption that he'd eventually show enough initiative at the company to earn the transfer of ownership. He didn't get out of the car alone. Sienna Montgomery was hanging off his arm before he'd even shut the driver's side door. She was a striking girl, tall and sharp-featured, dressed in a designer sundress that looked simple but cost more than a furnace installer's weekly wage. She was beautiful, certainly, but in the specific predatory way that makes a self-made man instinctively count his silverware when she walks into a room. They'd been together for 8 months. In those 8 months, I'd learned exactly one thing about Sienna Montgomery. She had never once asked me a single question about myself. Not, "How is the industrial market, Mr. Vance?" Not, "How did you manage to scale your first business during the '98 recession?" Nothing. She just watched. Her eyes, cool and gray as the boulder flatirons under cloud cover, calculated everything. She priced out the outdoor masonry. She evaluated the weight of the silver, and she looked at Julian like he was a stock she'd bought at an IPO and was waiting to dump at the peak. "Hey, Dad," Julian said, walking onto the patio and clapping me on the shoulder with a loose, casual familiarity that felt entirely practiced. "Smells incredible, what we got." "Your mother did the spread," I said, rising to shake his hand. His grip was soft, the grip of a boy who had never had to blister his palms on a pipe wrench. "I just paid for the prime ribeye." Sienna laughed at that. It was a high, musical sound that arrived exactly a half-second too late. Like she was translating my dry humor through some internal algorithm to see if it was safe to mock. "Happy Father's Day, Garrick," she said, her voice dripping with a honeyed, low-altitude sweetness. She reached out and gave me a brief, scent-heavy hug that smelled of expensive French jasmine and ambition. "You have such a magnificent home. Julian always talks about growing up here like it was some kind of modern castle." "It wasn't a castle, Sienna," I said, pulling back my chair. "It was a monument to 80-hour workweeks, Dad," Julian said, his laugh carrying a thin, sharp edge of warning. "Let her compliment the place. I'm just agreeing with her. It's gorgeous. Took you 12 years of grinding to pay off the land alone, right?" 14, I corrected. "But who's counting? Rich." Evangeline intervened quietly, using her nickname for me that only came out when she felt the room temperature dropping. "Sit. Let's eat before the meat gets cold." We got through the main course well enough at first. It was the standard theater of family gatherings. Evangeline carried the conversation, chatting about her charity auction in Cherry Hills and her tennis league, while I sat at the head of the table, half listening. Mostly, I was watching Julian. He checked his phone under the table 4 separate times during the first 20 minutes. Each time, his thumb would fly across the screen, his jaw tightening slightly before he'd slide the device back into his pocket and try to re-engage with a forced smile. Sienna was the one steering the ship. She was masterfully polite, asking Evangeline about the heirloom roses lining the western wall of the garden, inquiring about our ski chalet up in Vale, and offering just enough warmth to keep Evangeline smiling. But I noticed her hand. Every time Julian's phone buzzed in his pocket, Sienna's left hand would drift over and rest flat on his forearm. It wasn't a loving gesture. It was a stabilizing move, the way a veteran mechanic places a hand on a vibrating pump to keep it from rattling off its mount. She was keeping him steady. She was keeping him on script. Desert, a heavy, dark chocolate tart that Evangeline had imported from a patisserie in Denver, finally hit the linen. Julian cleared his throat. It was a dry, rasping sound, the exact same sound he'd made when he was 9 years old and standing in my study, waiting to tell me he'd taken the golf cart joyriding and wrapped it around the neighborhood mailbox. "So, Dad," Julian said, leaning his forearms on the table, violating his mother's long-standing rule about elbows, "I wanted to talk to you about something. Sienna and we've stumbled onto an extraordinary opportunity." There it was. The weather was changing in my knees. What kind of opportunity, Julian? I asked. I didn't reach for my dessert fork. I just sat back, folding my hands over my stomach. A real estate development venture, Julian said, his eyes lighting up with that dangerous, unearned excitement that only exists in people who have never lost their own money. Sienna's private investment circle, their flipping luxury, off-grid cabins up in the Breckenridge and Blue River markets. The returns are absolute madness, Dad. Like 32% annualized, fully secured by the physical deeds. We just need to inject some quick capital to secure the next parcel before the zoning laws shift next month. How much capital? I asked. My voice was flat. No inflection, no judgment. Just a request for a metric. Julian looked at Sienna. Sienna didn't blink. She just took a slow, elegant sip of her Pinot Noir, her eyes locked onto mine over the rim of the crystal. 250,000, Julian said. He tried to say it quickly, to make $250,000 sound like a rounding error on an invoice. We'd need you to cover 60% of our buy-in. Just a short-term bridge loan, Dad. 90 days, maybe 120 max. Once the first cabin closes, you get your principal back with 10% interest guaranteed. I let the number hang in the air. $250,000. To a boy like Julian, that was just a number on a screen. A magic key that unlocked a door to a world where he could finally sit at the big table. To me, that number was 5,000 hours of labor. It was 25 commercial boiler installations in the dead of a Colorado winter, when the grease on the fittings froze to your skin. It was the salary of 3 of my lead technicians for an entire year. 250,000. I repeated slowly, letting him hear the actual weight of the words. For a cabin flipping scheme you heard about from Sienna's investment circle. It's not a scheme, Dad, Julian said, his voice rising, the defensive armor sliding into place. It's an established development group. They have a pristine track record. Does this group have a name? I asked. Summit Crest Properties LLC. Sienna chimed in, her voice smooth, almost clinical in its confidence. They've already closed 3 properties in the high country this year alone. My close associate, Vivienne Laurent, has been a principal investor since last autumn. Her distributions have been cleared every single month. It's a closed-door syndicate, Garrick. Honestly, we're lucky to even get an allocation. Vivienne Laurent, I said, tasting the name. Does Vivienne have a corporate registry, a broker's license, a physical office that isn't a virtual address in a Denver co-working space? Garrick, please, Evangeline said quietly, her hand drifting across the linen to rest on my knee. Her fingers were tense. She knew the signs of an interrogation. I'm asking a business question, Eva, I said, keeping my eyes fixed on Sienna. If someone asks me for $250,000 on Father's Day, I get to ask for the tax ID number. That's how the world works. The truth was, I hadn't just started thinking about this today. Julian had floated the vague outlines of this high-country project to his mother 2 Sundays ago during her weekly phone call. He'd told her not to tell me, which, of course, meant she told me within 5 minutes of hanging up. She was worried. She knew Julian had no financial sense, and she knew he was desperate to prove himself. So, I'd spent the last 7 days quietly doing what 30 years of business survival had taught me to do. I made some phone calls. Julian, I said, leaning forward. I did some digging on Summit Crest Properties. Julian's face went stiff. The transition was instantaneous. He shot a sharp, accusatory glare at his mother, a silent, angry, "Why did you run to him?" Evangeline didn't look down. She met his gaze with the steady, quiet sorrow of a mother who had spent her life trying to cushion the blows between her husband and her son. "Yes, I did," I said, pulling his attention back to me. "Your mother told me. Did you honestly believe she'd keep a request for $250,000 a secret from the man who signs the checks?" "She's my wife, Julian. We don't have secrets, especially not ones that involve our retirement security or your financial ruin. Dad, don't start with the paternal protection routine. I checked the Colorado Secretary of State's database," I continued, my voice dropping an octave, steady as a diesel generator. Summit Crest Properties LLC was registered 45 days ago. The registered agent is a dummy corporation based out of Delaware. There are no contractor licenses associated with that entity in Summit County. There are no building permits filed for any of the 3 addresses Sienna's associate Vivienne listed on their pitch deck. In fact, those 3 parcels are currently owned by the U.S. Forest Service. You can't flip cabins on federal land, Julian. It's a phantom. The whole thing is a paper tiger built by people who know exactly how to target young men with wealthy fathers. You don't know what you're talking about. Julian stood up so fast his heavy cedar chair scraped violently against the flagstones, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. I knew you'd do this. I knew it. You run your little background checks. You make your little corporate phone calls, and you find some administrative technicality, just so you can tell me I'm too stupid to run a real deal. It's not a technicality, son, I said. It's fraud. Everything that isn't Vance Industrial is a fraud to you, Julian yelled, his face turning an angry, blotchy red. If it doesn't involve welding pipes or climbing into dirty crawl spaces, you think it's a scam. I've spent my entire life listening to you. Tell me how hard you worked, how many hours you put in, how much you sacrificed. But the second I try to build something of my own, the second I try to step out from under your shadow, you've got a spreadsheet ready to shoot me down. Julian, please, Evangeline begged, her eyes shining with tears. Sit down, sweetheart. Let's talk about this. No, Mom, I'm not sitting down. He turned his fury back to me, his chest heaving under his designer linen shirt. You don't believe in me. You've never believed in me. You think I'm still the 9-year-old kid who crashed the golf cart. You look at me, and you see a failure. You've kept me on a leash my entire life, holding your money over my head like a whip. That is entirely untrue, I said, and for the first time, I felt the cold anger beginning to warm into something dangerous. I have backed you in 3 separate business ventures, Julian. I paid your tuition at a private business college you barely attended. I paid the lease on your Denver office for a consulting firm that never signed a single client. I have believed in your potential since the day I first held you in the hospital. But believing in your potential and handing $250,000 to a con artist are 2 completely different things. See? There it is. She's a con artist now? Sienna is standing right here. Sienna didn't look offended. In fact, if I didn't know better, I would have said her posture had improved. She sat perfectly upright, watching Julian's meltdown with the quiet, detached interest of a theater critic watching an opening night performance. You can't just trust me, Julian hissed, his voice cracking with a raw, childish resentment that had been festering for a decade. Just once. You couldn't just say, I believe in you, son. Here's the support. You had to destroy it. Trust is earned through competence, Julian, I said. Not through tantrums. Then you know what? Julian leaned over the table, his face inches from mine, his breath hot. I wish you'd never been my dad. I wish I'd had a father who actually let me live my own life instead of trying to own it. The backyard went dead silent. It was the kind of quiet that follows a lightning strike, where the air itself feels charged, metallic, and heavy. Even the mountain breeze seemed to die in the pine trees surrounding the lake. Evangeline's hand on my knee tightened so hard her nails cut through my trousers. She was looking at Julian with a mixture of horror and heartbreak, her mouth slightly open, waiting for me to break, waiting for the explosion she'd been managing for 26 years. But I didn't explode. I looked at my son, really looked at him. I saw the expensive watch on his wrist that I had bought him for his graduation. I saw the Italian leather shoes on his feet. I saw the soft hands, the perfect teeth, the total lack of struggle in his eye. I had spent 26 years trying to build a shield between him and the cold, hard edges of the world, and all it had done was make him despise the shield. I stood up. I did it slowly, my joints aching slightly from a lifetime of physical labor. I took my linen napkin, folded it into a neat, perfect square, and placed it on the table next to my half-eaten prime ribeye. Then live as if you never had one, I said. My voice wasn't loud. I didn't need to shout. Some sentences land with the weight of a sledgehammer even when they're delivered in a whisper. I watched the words hit his face. The blotchy red anger vanished, replaced instantly by a pale, hollow shock. For a fraction of a second, the defensive swagger dropped, and he looked 12 years old again, standing in the garage after breaking something he couldn't afford to replace. Dad, wait, he stammered, his hand reaching out instinctively. I didn't wait. I walked past him. I walked past Sienna's wide, assessing eyes. I walked past Evangeline, who was calling my name in a cracked, broken voice, a sound I hadn't heard since her own father's funeral 15 years ago. I walked through the French doors of our home, through the cool marble entryway, and out into the blazing June sun of the driveway. The Audi e-tron GT was parked near the fountain, its sleek metallic skin reflecting the Colorado sky. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my master key fob, the one that overrode all others, and pressed the unlock button. The car beeped, its flush door handles presenting themselves to me like a silent invitation. I got in. The interior smelled of new leather, expensive cologne, and Julian's careless lifestyle. There were empty high-end coffee cups in the cup holders, a pair of designer sunglasses on the dash, and a gym bag thrown carelessly in the back seat. I started the engine, or rather, the electric system booted up with a low digital chime. I pulled out of the driveway, the gravel crunching under the wide tires. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if Julian was standing on the porch, or if Evangeline was crying, or if Sienna was already calculating her next move. I just drove. My phone, sitting in the center console, buzzed before I had even cleared the gates of our subdivision. Julian, bring my car back right now or I'm calling the police. I stopped at the red light on Orchard Road. The steering wheel felt thick and solid in my hands. A cold, heavy weight was settling into my chest, but it wasn't anger anymore. It was something much cleaner than anger. It was clarity. It was the feeling a builder gets when he realizes a foundation is too cracked to save, and the only choice left is to let the structure fall so he can see what's actually salvageable in the ruins. Another text came through a second later. Julian, I mean it, Dad. I'm not playing. You can't just steal my car because you're mad. My car, the boy honestly believed it. He had convinced himself that 12 months of driving a vehicle paid for by my company's depreciation schedule, insured by my commercial carrier, and maintained by my service department made it his. He had confused a privilege with a right, a gift with an inheritance. I picked up the phone, unlocked the screen, and typed 4 words. It was never yours. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat, put my foot on the accelerator, and merged onto the highway. I didn't go home. I didn't want to go back to the empty mansion where Evangeline would eventually return, tearful and exhausted, begging me to make peace. I drove north past the sprawling suburbs of Denver, past the glass towers of downtown, and out toward the open, windswept plains of Weld County. The Audi ran beautifully. It was silent, powerful, and entirely detached from the road beneath it. It was a vehicle designed for people who wanted to travel at 80 miles an hour, without ever feeling the friction of the earth. It was the perfect car for Julian. Around 6 p.m., I pulled the car into the lot of my flagship Vance Industrial Service Center in Lafayette. The gates were locked for the holiday, the massive flat-roofed warehouse sitting dark under the high-altitude sun. Rows of white service vans, each emblazoned with the blue Vance Industrial logo, stood in perfect, silent formation like soldiers waiting for Monday morning. I parked the Audi in my reserved spot under the metal awning, turned off the power, and just sat there. The cabin of the car was dead silent. I watched the sky turn from brilliant blue to a deep bruised violet over the mountains. Evangeline called me 9 times before midnight. I let the first 4 calls go to voicemail. On the 5th, I finally picked up, because 29 years of marriage means you don't leave your wife wondering if you've driven off a canyon road. Garrick, where are you? Her voice was frantic, thin, and tired. You need to come home, right now. Julian is a complete wreck. He's sitting on the kitchen steps, he won't eat, and he's talking about what, Eva? I asked. My voice was calm, too calm. He's saying you've ruined his life, Garrick. He's saying you took his car to humiliate him in front of Sienna. I took my car, Eva, I said. The car registered to my company. The car he hasn't paid a single dime of insurance or registration on in 12 months. You didn't have to do it like that, she cried. Not on Father's Day, not in front of her. He chose the stage, Eva, I said. He chose the day, he chose the audience, and he chose the words. He told me he wished I'd never existed. I'm simply granting his wish. If I don't exist, then my cars don't exist, my money doesn't exist, and my safety net doesn't exist. He wanted to see what life looks like without Garrick Vance. I'm giving him the room to look, Garrick, please. I'm staying at a hotel tonight, Eva, I said, cutting her off before she could use the tone of voice that had kept me soft for 3 decades. I love you. I'll see you tomorrow. I hung up, turned my phone to silent, and checked into the St. Julien Hotel in downtown Boulder. I ordered a club sandwich from room service that I didn't touch. I lay on the king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly in the dark, running the entire dinner back in my head like game film. I knew what was coming. I'd known for days. But knowing a storm is coming doesn't make the frost any warmer when it finally hits the ground. By 7 the next morning, my phone had 14 missed calls and 11 unread text messages, all from Julian. Julian, you're a thief. You know that, right, Julian? Mom says you're at some hotel. Real mature, Dad. Real professional. Julian, I called the police. They're on their way to the house. You want to explain to them why you stole a registered vehicle, or should I let them file the grand theft report? I sat in the hotel lobby, sipping a cup of black coffee, reading the messages one by one. I didn't feel my heart rate rise. I didn't feel the heat in my face. When you've spent 30 years dealing with union disputes, contract defaults, and million-dollar litigations, a 26-year-old's text threats look like crayon drawings. File the report, son, I murmured to the empty lobby. Let's see how that paperwork shakes out. I checked out of the hotel at 8:30 a.m. and drove the Audi back to Cherry Hills Village. The morning traffic was heavy, commuters rushing into Denver in their clean SUVs, but I took my time. I listened to the quiet hum of the road. When I pulled onto my street, my suspicion was confirmed. A Cherry Hills Village police cruiser was parked in my driveway, its engine idling though the emergency lights were off. Julian was standing on the front porch, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face pale and tight from a lack of sleep. He was wearing the same clothes from yesterday. The expensive linen shirt, now rumpled and creased, Chloe Sienna, was nowhere to be seen. Her Mercedes SUV was gone from the curb. Her first smart move of the weekend. She'd left the blast radius before the fallout landed. A young officer, no older than 28, was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, clipboard in hand, looking thoroughly exhausted by whatever drama Julian had been feeding him for the last hour. His badge read Officer Callahan. I parked the Audi directly behind the police cruiser, opened the door, and stepped out. "There he is," Julian shouted, pointing an accusing finger at me as I walked up the driveway. His voice had an ugly, jagged edge of panic and triumph. "That's him. That's the man who took the vehicle, officer. I told you." He admitted it in a text. Officer Callahan turned to look at me, his hand resting casually near his utility belt, though his posture remained relaxed. He'd clearly realized within 5 minutes of arriving that this was a wealthy family dispute, not a carjacking. "Sir," Callahan said, stepping toward me. "Are you Garrick Vance?" "I am," I said, reaching into my suit jacket. I pulled out a small leather folder containing the vehicle's original title, the corporate registry for Vance Industrial Systems, and the commercial insurance card. I'd stopped by my Lafayette office at 8 a.m. to retrieve them. I handed the folder to the officer. "I believe you'll find everything you need in there." Callahan took the folder, flipped through the documents, and nodded slowly. He looked at the registration, then at the title, and then back at Julian. "Mr. Julian Vance," Callahan said, his voice flat. "Is your name on this title?" "No, but I've been the sole driver for 12 months, Julian argued, his voice rising a pitch. "It's my car. My dad gave it to me for my birthday. Everyone knows it's my car." "Is there a written transfer of ownership?" the officer asked. "Any signed gift affidavit, a bill of sale?" "No, he's my father. We don't do bills of sale for family gifts." "Actually, we do," I said quietly. "If the gift belongs to a corporate entity that files federal tax returns. The vehicle is registered to Vance Industrial Systems. I am the sole shareholder and president of that corporation. Julian was permitted to use the vehicle as a benefit of his employment with my firm." "I quit the company in March, Dad," Julian yelled, his face turning that ugly blotchy red again. "Which is exactly when your authorization to operate corporate property terminated," I said. "I simply chose not to enforce the recovery until yesterday. My mistake. I've corrected it." Officer Callahan handed the leather folder back to me. He closed his clipboard with a sharp plastic snap that sounded like a final gavel. Callahan said to Julian, his tone softening but remaining firm. If the vehicle is registered to a corporation and this gentleman owns the corporation, there is no auto theft here. It's a corporate vehicle, and he has the legal right to possess it at any time. This is a civil matter. I can't file a report for a vehicle you don't legally own. But he took it. Julian's voice cracked. He looked at the officer, then at me, his eyes wide and desperate. He looked entirely humiliated, standing on the grand porch of the house he thought he owned, being told by a man with a badge that he had no right to the metal he'd been parading around town. I understand you're upset, sir, Callahan said, giving me a polite, professional nod that spoke volumes. It was the look one working man gives another when they both realize they're dealing with a boy who has never had his hands dirty. But my job here is done. Have a good morning, gentlemen. We stood in silence as the cruiser backed out of the driveway, its tires whisper quiet on the clean asphalt, leaving us alone in the Colorado sun. Julian stared at me, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. You humiliated me, he hissed, his teeth bare. You let the police come to our house, over a company car. You did that to me. I didn't call them, Julian, I said, pocketing the leather folder. You did. I drove my own car away from a table where you told me you wished I'd never existed. Forgive me if I didn't stick around to hand you the keys on my way out of your life. He opened his mouth to speak, to throw another handful of resentment at me, but before he could, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a sharp, aggressive vibration that seemed to pull the air right out of his lungs. He pulled the phone out, looked at the screen, and I watched the remaining color drain from his face so fast he looked almost translucent under the morning sun. What is it, Julian? I asked. My voice was level, neutral. He didn't answer. He just stared at the screen, his thumb trembling slightly. Then, slowly, with the mechanical movement of a soldier who had just been hit by a mortar, he turned the screen toward me. It was a text from Sienna. Sienna, call me right now. Vivienne says the escrow account has been flagged by the bank. Some compliance hold. She's not answering her office line. Julian, what did your father do? Did he call someone? I looked at the screen, then up at my son. The other shoe, I said. It always drops eventually. I had spent the previous Thursday in my private office at the Lafayette headquarters, sitting across from an old friend named Sterling Croft. Sterling is a chief investigator for the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. We'd known each other since we were 30, back when he was a beat cop and I was running service calls out of the back of my rusted van. I had handed Sterling a copy of the pitch deck Julian had left on our kitchen counter 2 weeks prior, the one detailing the Blue River luxury development by Summit Crest Properties, LLC. Sterling had looked at the papers for exactly 3 minutes before he let out a dry, hacking laugh. Garrick, he had said, leaning back in his leather chair. This isn't a development syndicate. This is a ghost ship. The LLC was set up through a registered agent in Delaware that specializes in non-disclosing entities. The phone numbers go to disposable VoIP lines. And this name here, Vivienne Laurent, that's an alias. Her real name is Vivienne Lemaire. She's been run out of Oregon and Idaho for the exact same play. Fake land zoning schemes targeting young, trust fund kids whose parents have more money than oversight. They set up a beautiful website, create some fake escrow accounts, and press for urgent wire transfers to lock in properties that don't exist. By the time the kids realize the land belongs to the county or the state, Vivienne is in Cabo and the accounts are empty. And the girls? I had asked. The ones who bring the kids to the table. The finders. Sterling shrugged. They get 10–15% of the wire. They find a lonely kid with a wealthy father, feed his ego, make him feel like a big-time investor, and lead him straight to the slaughterhouse. It's a classic front door play. I hadn't told Julian. I wanted to. God knows, as his father, every instinct in my body had screamed at me to grab him by the shoulders, show him the CBI reports, and lock him in his room until he came to his senses. But I knew my son. I knew that if I showed him the proof, he wouldn't see a father saving him from a con. He'd see a dictator trying to crush his dreams. He'd see a controller trying to keep him small. Some lessons can't be taught on a whiteboard. They have to be paid for in blood and cold, hard cash. Julian, I said, stepping closer to him on the porch. Summit Properties is a shell. Vivian Laurent is currently being investigated by the CBI for wire fraud. The properties they told you they were flipping are federal land. The escrow account you sent your money to isn't an escrow account at all. It's a private clearing account in Panama. He stared at me, his eyes wide and glassy, his breathing shallow. How long have you known this? He whispered. Since Thursday, I said. And you didn't tell me. His voice cracked, a high, desperate sob breaking through his chest. You let me sit there at dinner. You let me beg you. You let me look like an idiot in front of Sienna. When you had the proof the whole time. I tried to tell you at dinner, Julian, I said, my voice dropping into that quiet, solemn register. The very first question I asked was about the LLC filing. I tried to warn you about the lack of permits. But you didn't want a warning. You wanted a check. You told me you wished I'd never been your dad, because I wouldn't hand you $250,000 without questions. You wanted your independence. This is what it looks like. Where's Sienna? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She's not answering, Julian whispered, looking down at his phone as if it had turned into a venomous snake. I tried calling her 3 times while the cop was here. It goes straight to voicemail. Her Instagram is gone, Dad. Her account is just deactivated. Of course it is, I said. The CBI frozen the clearing account this morning at 8 a.m. The second the money stopped moving, Sienna's job was done. She's probably already on a flight to Scottsdale or Miami, looking for her next allocation. Julian slid down the brick pillar of the porch, his knees giving out, until he was sitting flat on the stone steps, his head in his hands. He looked so small, the expensive linen shirt, the designer shoes, the gold-plated lifestyle. All of it looked like a costume that didn't fit. I sent them the money, Dad, he sobbed into his palms. I didn't wait for your check. I wanted to surprise you. I wanted to show you I could do it myself. How much did you send, Julian? My savings, he choked out. The $65,000 from the trust my grandfather left me when I turned 25. And I took out a $10,000 cash advance on my platinum card because Sienna said we needed to show good faith to Vivienne to keep the allocation. $75,000, drained in a single Thursday afternoon wire transfer. Gone into the ether of a Panamanian bank account, never to be seen again. I looked down at him. Part of me, the father who had spent 26 years patching up his scraped knees, paying his credit card bills, and making excuses for his failures, wanted to reach down, pull him up, and tell him we'd find a way to get it back. I wanted to call Sterling Croft, call our corporate lawyers, and use every ounce of my influence to fix it. But if I fixed it now, he'd never learn how to swim. He'd just learn that no matter how deep he dove into the dark water, his father would always dive in and drown in his place. I'm going inside, I said, my voice steady, empty of pity. Your mother has been up all night, and I need to wash the hotel dust off my face. Julian looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt, his voice a tiny, desperate whimper. What do I do? My bank account is negative. The credit card company is already calling about the cash advance limit. I can't pay the rent on my loft next week. I have nothing. I paused at the front door, my hand resting on the heavy brass handle. I didn't turn around. You wanted to live like you never had a father, Julian, I said. Figure it out like one. I opened the door, stepped into the cool, quiet house, and let the heavy wood door click shut behind me. For the next 5 days, I did the hardest thing a father can ever do. I did absolutely nothing. Julian called me 6 times the first day, 9 times the second. By the 3rd day, the calls stopped, replaced by late-night text messages that read like the journal entries of a man stranded at sea. Julian, please, Dad, just talk to me. I'm sorry. I was an idiot. I know that now. Just tell me what to do. Julian, they're evicting me. The landlord won't accept a partial payment. I have to be out by Friday, Julian. I had to sell my watch. The Omega Grandpa gave me. I only got $3,000 for it because I didn't have the original box. It didn't even cover the interest on the card advance. Please, Dad. Evangeline walked around our home like a ghost. She didn't scream at me, she didn't argue, but the silence between us was heavier than any shout. Every time she looked at the empty seat at the dinner table, I could see the pain in her eyes. He's sleeping in his car, Garrick, she said to me on the 4th night, her voice barely a whisper as we lay in bed. "He's 26, Eva," I said, staring at the dark window. "He's not a child. He has a degree. He has a body that works. If he sleeps in his car for a few nights, he'll realize that the metal around him was paid for by the father he wished didn't exist." "You're so cold," she whispered, turning her back to me. "No, Eva," I said to the dark. "I'm just tired of keeping him warm while he burns our house down." On the 5th day, I was sitting in my glass-walled office at the Lafayette headquarters, reviewing the quarterly commercial sales reports. My sales manager, Greg, knocked on the door frame, his expression hesitant. "Garrick," Greg said, clearing his throat. "Your boy's out by the loading dock. He's been standing near the service bays for about 20 minutes. One of the techs asked if he wanted to come in, but he said he didn't want to disturb you. You want me to send him up?" I looked through the glass window, down toward the sprawling concrete yard where our commercial installation trucks were loaded. Sure enough, Julian was standing near the edge of the bay, out of the way of the forklifts. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and old sneakers. He looked thin, his shoulders hunched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like any other kid off the street looking for day labor. "No," I said to Greg. "Let him wait 10 minutes. Then tell him I'll meet him in the service bay." I made him wait. It was petty, perhaps, but petty is a luxury you earn when your kid calls the cops on you. When I finally walked down the metal stairs into the concrete service bay, the smell of oil, sheet metal, and diesel exhaust was thick in the air. Julian was sitting on an upturned plastic bucket near the scrap metal bin, his head down. "You wanted to see me, Julian?" I asked, my voice carrying over the hum of the warehouse exhaust fans. He jumped, standing up quickly, wiping his hands on his jeans as if they were dirty. He looked wrecked. Not the dramatic, loud kind of wrecked, but the quiet, deep-seated exhaustion that lives behind the eyes of a man who has run out of options. "Dad," he said, his voice barely audible over the din of the shop. I didn't know where else to go. This is where I work," I said. "If you have something to say it here." He flinched, looking around at the technicians who were loading sheet metal onto a flatbed nearby. They knew him. They'd seen him pull up in the Audi in previous years, wearing his clean suits and acting like he owned the place. Now they were looking at him with a quiet, working-class curiosity. "I lost everything," Julian said, his eyes filling with tears that he tried desperately to blink away. "The loft is gone. I had to put my things in a public storage unit in Denver. Sienna. Her phone is completely disconnected. I went to her apartment, and the leasing manager said she moved out on Tuesday morning. She didn't even pack her furniture, Dad. She just took her bags and left. The police, they said because I wired the money voluntarily, there's almost no chance of recovery. It's gone. $75,000. My entire life savings." "I know," I said. "I can't make the minimum payment on my credit card," he sobbed, his voice breaking completely. "The interest is 30%. I can't buy groceries. I've been eating protein bars from my gym bag for 3 days. I'm asking you for help, Dad. Please, just a loan. Just $5,000 to get me into a studio apartment and pay off the card advance. I'll pay you back. I swear to God I will." I looked at him. I looked at the tears, the wrinkled shirt, the absolute collapse of his pride. "No," I said. He stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "What?" "I am not signing a check, Julian," I said, my voice as hard and cold as the concrete beneath our feet. "I am not bailing you out of a mess you made with a con artist after I explicitly warned you against it. You wanted to live without a father. Fathers don't hand their adult sons $75,000 to cover the cost of their vanity. You wanted your independence. Live with it. Figure out the rent. Figure out the credit card. Figure out your life, Dad. Please? I have nowhere to go. I'm sleeping in the Audi in a Walmart parking lot in Westminster. Your mother's guest room is still there," I said. "And the kitchen has food. That is the exact boundary of what you are getting from this family right now. A roof over your head and a hot meal. No cash. No credit cards. No car keys." He stood there, his jaw trembling, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles were white. For a second I thought he was going to spit at me, or yell, or walk out into the Colorado sun and never come back. But he didn't. He didn't have the currency for anger anymore. "Okay," he whispered, his head dropping. "Okay." Julian moved into our guest room that evening, It was a strange, silent transition. He brought exactly 2 suitcases of clothes. The rest of his life was locked in a 15 by 15 storage unit off Interstate 70. I set the rules on the first night, sitting at the kitchen island while Evangeline watched from the doorway, her eyes silent but grateful that her boy was safe under her roof. "You don't drive the Audi," I said to Julian, who sat across from me, staring at a plate of chicken he'd cleared in 3 minutes. "You don't use our credit cards. You pay your mother $100 a week for utilities and board. If you don't have it, you find a job that pays it. And you find it by Friday." He didn't argue. He sold his grandfather's vintage Omega Seamaster to a pawn shop in Denver for $3,000 to cover the immediate minimum on his credit card. And he took a job as a food runner and busser at a high-volume steakhouse in Littleton. For the next 3 weeks, our home was defined by a quiet, exhausting routine. Every morning, I'd be up at 5:30 a.m. for my coffee, and Julian would be asleep in the guest room, having returned from his shift at 1:30 a.m., smelling of fried grease, expensive red wine he hadn't tasted, and sweat. Some mornings I'd pass him in the kitchen as he was getting ready for his double shift, wearing his black restaurant polo, his hands red and dry from the industrial dishwashers. He didn't ask me for a single dollar. Not once. He didn't complain about his feet or the customers, or the fact that he was 26 years old and carrying plates of steak to people his own age, who were spending their parents' money. He just worked. He went to work, he came home, he cleaned his room, and every Friday morning, he left a $100 bill flat on the kitchen island before I woke up. Evangeline watched him with a quiet pride that slowly began to replace the sorrow in her eyes. "He's changing, Garrick," she said to me one night as we watched him from the living room window. He was outside in the dark, manually sweeping the pine needles off our driveway with an old push broom. He hadn't been asked to do it. He'd just seen it needed doing. "He's not changing, Eva," I said. "He's just finally discovering the weight of the earth. He's discovering that things don't stay clean or paid for unless someone does the sweeping." On the 4th Sunday, around 9 p.m., I walked out into the garage to grab a bottle of water from the secondary fridge. The lights were on. Julian was sitting on a plastic storage crate in the corner, surrounded by several cardboard boxes he'd retrieved from his storage unit. He had a legal pad on his knees, a pen behind his ear, and dozens of sheets of paper spread out on the concrete floor around him. He didn't hear me come in. I stood there for a moment, watching him. He was going through his old business plan for the Summit Crest project, the text messages with Sienna, the fake wire confirmations, and a handwritten ledger of his own savings. "You keeping that for a reason?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. He jumped, his pen slipping from his hand. He looked up, his face flushing slightly, before he settled back onto the crate. "Just a reminder, I guess," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the old bravado. "A reminder of what an absolute idiot looks like on paper. $75,000. Just completely vaporized because I wanted to feel like a big shot." He looked down at the legal pad, tracing a line of numbers with his thumb. "The escrow account," he said, letting out a dry, hollow laugh. "It wasn't even an escrow account. It was just a private checking account Vivienne had opened under a fake name. Sienna knew. She had to have known. I went back through our texts. Every time I asked for a legal document, every time I asked for a contract, she'd change the subject or tell me I was being too rigid, like you. She used my own resentment of you to keep me from asking the questions that would have saved me." "She was very good at her job, Julian," I said, leaning against the fender of the Audi. "I know," he said. He paused, looking up at me, his eyes clear and steady in the harsh fluorescent light of the garage. "Why didn't you just lay it all out at dinner, Dad? Why didn't you just show me the CBI reports instead of letting me call the cops on you? Why let me go through all this?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me, Julian," I said gently. "If I had shown you those papers at that table, you would have told me I fabricated them. You would have told me I was using my influence to destroy your future because I was jealous of your success. You had already decided that I was the enemy. Sometimes, a father has to let his son hit the wall at 80 miles an hour because he's tired of trying to pull him out of the driver's seat." Julian looked down at the concrete floor. His shoulders began to shake. He didn't sob loudly. It was a quiet, deep-seated weeping. The sound of a young man finally letting go of 10 years of false pride and unearned anger. The weight of the Littleton steakhouse, the $75,000, the betrayal of the woman he thought he loved, and the realization that his father had been standing there the whole time trying to catch him. It all came out in the quiet of the garage. I didn't stay by the car. I walked over, sat down on the concrete step next to his plastic crate, and let him finish. I didn't reach out to pat his back. I didn't tell him it was going to be okay. A man has to finish his crying before comfort means anything. When his breathing finally steadied, I looked at the legal pad on his lap. Back in February, I said quietly, I had our corporate lawyers draw up the paperwork to transfer the title of the Audi to you outright for your birthday. It's been sitting in my bottom desk drawer for 6 months. Julian looked at me, his eyes red and wide with shock. You were going to give it to me? I said. And there's more. When you turned 18, I set up a trust account, Vance Capital Partners. It has $200,000 in it. It's been building interest for 8 years. It was designed to be your seed capital. It was meant to help you start a real business, Julian. Something with a real business model, real employees, and a real chance of surviving a basic audit. Something you could be proud of. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. You had all that the whole time I was screaming at you? The whole time I was calling you a dictator at your own table? I did, I said. Why didn't you just give it to me over the last 3 weeks? He whispered, his voice cracked with shame. Why'd you let me sell Grandpa's watch? Why'd you let me bust tables until my hands bled? Because a father who hands his son everything the second he cries doesn't teach him anything except that crying works, I said. I didn't need to know you were sorry because you got scammed, Julian. I needed to know you were sorry because you understood what your pride had done to this family. I needed to know you were ready to earn your life, not just inherit it. 3 weeks of carrying plates for tips taught you that better than any check I could have signed. He sat there for a long time, the silence of the garage wrapping around us. He looked at the legal pad, then at the papers on the floor, and finally at me. I'm not giving you the trust today, Julian, I added, keeping my voice firm. It's still there, it's still yours. But it comes with conditions now. You're going to write a real business plan. You're going to bring it to my office. And you're going to sit there while I pick it apart, line by line, the way I should have been allowed to pick apart Summit Crest Properties before you signed away your savings. You're going to prove to me that you know how to build a foundation before I let you build a roof. Julian looked at me, and for the first time in a year, a real honest smile broke through his tired face. That's fair, Dad, he said, his voice steady. That's more than fair. And he meant it. Some men win by taking things away. But at 58 years old, I've found there is a much sharper, much sweeter kind of winning, making your son earn back what you were always planning to give him anyway.